Oh my gosh, Cooper, what did you do? Sarah Taylor stood frozen on her front porch, her golden retriever wagging his tail proudly at her feet. Clutched between his teeth was a tiny pink baby shoe, smudged with dirt. The sight of it sent a chill racing down Sarah's spine. She had lived in this quiet neighborhood in Michigan for 5 years, and as far as she knew, there weren't any babies living nearby. So where on earth had Cooper found this? Her heart pounded as she bent down, reaching carefully for the shoe. Cooper let go of it easily, panting happily like he had just done the greatest thing in the world. Sarah examined the shoe closely. It was small, barely big enough for an infant's foot, and though it was slightly dirty, it didn't look like it had been out in the elements for long. "Where did you get this, boy?" she asked, looking down at her dog. Cooper's ears perked up at her voice, his golden coat shining under the soft morning sun. He trotted down the porch steps and onto the grass, looking back at her expectantly. A sinking feeling settled in Sarah's chest. She glanced toward the woods that bordered the backyards of her quiet suburban street. If Cooper had found the shoe, that meant there had to be more. Maybe even a matching one. Maybe. She swallowed hard, pushing away the thoughts that threatened to spiral into fear. Cooper was a good dog. He had never brought anything home before. No old socks, no lost tennis balls from the neighbor's yard. Nothing. And now, out of nowhere, a baby's shoe? She stepped back into the house and grabbed her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Should she call someone? The police? That felt a little extreme. After all, it was just a shoe. Maybe it belonged to someone visiting a neighbor, and it had fallen out of a stroller. That was reasonable, right? She let out a breath, shaking her head. "Come on, Cooper. Show me." The golden retriever's tail wagged even harder, and he trotted off across the yard, nose to the ground. Sarah followed, her sneakers crunching against the slightly damp grass. The air smelled of morning dew, fresh-cut lawns, and a hint of something she couldn't quite place. Something earthy. Something deep and hidden. As she stepped closer to the tree line, a flicker of movement caught her eye. The trees stood tall, their thick trunks creating a barrier between the safety of her neighborhood and the mystery that lay beyond. Cooper paused near a bush, sniffing excitedly. Sarah's breath hitched as she spotted something else poking out from beneath the tangled leaves. Something small, something soft. A tiny onesie. Sarah's stomach lurched as she crouched down. The fabric was wrinkled but intact, the light pink color standing out against the dirt and greenery. She reached for it with trembling fingers, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. This wasn't just some lost item. This wasn't something a passing jogger had dropped. A baby's onesie and a single shoe. What were the chances? Her throat tightened. "Oh no," Cooper whined softly beside her, nudging her arm as if to say, "Do something." She straightened up quickly, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The air had shifted. It felt heavier now, like the trees were leaning in, whispering secrets she wasn't meant to hear. She had to call someone. She had to find out what was going on. Turning on her heel, she ran back toward the house, Cooper bounding behind her. Inside, she grabbed her phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. The line rang twice before a woman's voice answered. "This is Officer Caldwell. What's your emergency?" Sarah hesitated for only a second before speaking. "Hi, my name is Sarah Taylor, and I think I might have found something. Something serious." A pause. "What do you mean, ma'am?" She swallowed hard. "My dog just brought home a baby's shoe, and I found a onesie in the woods behind my house." The officer's voice changed, taking on a more serious tone. "Stay where you are. We're sending someone over." Sarah ended the call and sat down heavily on her couch, the shoe still clenched in her hand. Cooper lay at her feet, his big brown eyes watching her carefully. What had he found? And more importantly, who did it belong to? 15 minutes later, the sound of tires crunching on gravel made her jump. A patrol car pulled into her driveway, and 2 officers stepped out. One was a tall man in his 40s with graying hair, while the other was a younger woman with sharp, watchful eyes. They approached the house with a steady, practiced pace. "Miss Taylor?" the older officer asked as she opened the door. "Yes. Thank you for coming." "You said you found something unusual," the younger officer prompted, glancing down at the shoe in Sarah's hand. She nodded and led them outside, pointing toward the woods. "Cooper brought this home this morning. And then I found the onesie right over there." The officers exchanged a glance before stepping toward the tree line. The younger officer knelt down, picking up the onesie with gloved hands. She examined it carefully before nodding to her partner. "We'll need to check the area," the older officer said. "Are you okay if we take a look around?" "Of course," Sarah said quickly. I have no idea how it got there." "We'll find out," the younger officer assured her before radioing for backup. Sarah watched as they disappeared into the woods, her pulse racing. Cooper sat beside her, wagging his tail as if he had done the best job in the world. And maybe, just maybe, he had. She just wasn't sure she was ready for the answer he had led her to find. Sarah paced on her porch as the officers disappeared into the woods, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The morning air was still cool, but a nervous sweat had formed along the back of her neck. Her thoughts spun in circles. A baby's shoe. A onesie. And now the police were searching the woods behind her house. What if... No, she didn't want to think about it. Not yet. Not until she knew more. Cooper sat at her feet, his tail wagging slightly but his ears flicking toward the woods every few moments. He was watching, waiting, like he knew something more was coming. She bent down, running a hand through his soft fur. "You're a good boy," she murmured. "I just wish I knew what you were trying to tell me." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Sarah could hear the occasional radio static from the officers, the rustling of leaves as they moved through the underbrush. Then, a shout. Her stomach dropped. She stepped to the edge of the porch, gripping the railing. The shout came again, this time clearer. "We've got something!" Her breath caught. Her feet moved before she could stop herself, hurrying toward the woods. She didn't get far before the younger officer emerged, her expression serious. "Miss Taylor?" she called, holding up a hand to stop her. "We need you to stay here." Sarah's heart pounded. "What did you find?" The officer hesitated before exchanging a look with her partner, who was now stepping out of the trees. "We can't say just yet, but we need more personnel out here." Sarah swallowed hard. More personnel? That meant something big, something bad. She tightened her arms around herself. "Is it?" she started, but stopped herself. She didn't want to finish that sentence, didn't want to put that thought into the air. The older officer gave her a steady look. "We're handling it, Miss Taylor. Just stay put for now." Handling it. That meant no answers. At least, not yet. She nodded slowly, stepping back. The officers radioed for backup, and within 20 minutes, another 2 patrol cars pulled up, followed by a vehicle marked with the county's crime scene unit. Sarah's stomach twisted. Crime scene. That couldn't be good. One of the newcomers, a detective judging by the way he carried himself, walked up to her with a notepad in hand. "Miss Taylor, I'm Detective Marks. I understand you were the one who initially found the items." She nodded, her voice feeling stuck in her throat. Yes. Well, Cooper found the shoe. Marks glanced down at the golden retriever, who sat attentively beside her. Smart dog. Then his expression turned serious again. Can you walk me through everything? From the moment you saw the shoe? Sarah inhaled shakily and started from the beginning, recounting how Cooper had trotted up to the house with the tiny pink shoe, and how she had followed him to the onesie in the woods. The detective scribbled notes as she spoke, only nodding occasionally. When she finished, he flipped the notepad shut and sighed. We've located more items, he said carefully. A small blanket, a pacifier, and he hesitated for the first time. Other evidence. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears. Evidence of what? The detective's face remained unreadable. We won't know for sure until we complete a thorough search. That wasn't an answer. Not really. But the way he avoided looking directly at her told Sarah everything she needed to know. Something bad had happened in those woods. The next few hours were a blur. More officers arrived. Crime scene tape was stretched along the tree line, and Sarah was gently but firmly told to stay away. Neighbors started to take notice, stepping onto their porches, whispering among themselves. Some walked over to ask what was going on, but all Sarah could do was shake her head. She didn't have any more answers than they did. The sun was beginning to lower when Detective Marks returned to her porch. He looked tired, his sleeves rolled up, his notepad tucked into his back pocket. We're going to have to conduct a more extensive search, he told her. That means we'll be out here for a while. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Does that mean… She stopped. She wasn't sure how to ask. Marks sighed. We don't know yet. But if there's anything else you can remember, any strange noises, unfamiliar cars in the area, anything at all, it could help. She shook her head. I wish I could think of something, but no, nothing seemed off before today. Marks nodded slowly. All right. If you do remember anything, call me. He handed her a card, then glanced down at Cooper again. Your dog may have helped us find something important today. Sarah managed a weak smile. He's a good boy. Marks gave a small nod before stepping off the porch and back toward the woods. Sarah watched him go, her stomach still twisted in knots. She had thought today would be just another normal morning. A quiet day with coffee on the porch, Cooper lounging at her feet. But now, as the sun sank lower and the flashing lights from the police vehicles cast eerie glows against the trees, she knew nothing would be the same after this. Cooper had found something that had been hidden. And whatever it was, it had changed everything. That night, Sarah hardly slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the pink shoe, the onesie, the way the officers had whispered among themselves. Something had happened in those woods, and someone out there had to know what, but who? And more importantly, why? Cooper lay at the foot of her bed, his tail flicking now and then. He had done his job. He had found something important. But now, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be uncovered. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of a knock at the door. Her heart lurched as she hurried to open it. Detective Marks stood there, his face unreadable. Miss Taylor, he said, his voice steady. We need to talk. Sarah's fingers tightened around the edge of the door as she took in the detective's expression. The morning light cast long shadows across her porch, and for a moment she wondered if she was still dreaming. But no, Detective Marks was standing there, and his presence alone was enough to set her nerves on edge. "What is it?" she asked, swallowing the lump in her throat. Marks glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure no one was listening, then met her gaze. "May I come in?" Sarah hesitated for only a second before stepping aside. Cooper trotted up beside her, his tail wagging slightly, but his ears were perked as if he sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Marks stepped inside, taking in the cozy but slightly disheveled living room. Sarah hadn't slept much, and the evidence was in the untouched coffee on the table and the wrinkled blanket tossed over the couch. "Did you find something?" she asked, shutting the door behind him. Marks exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're still piecing things together. But we did find more clothing, farther into the woods. The items were partially buried, and some of them had been out there for a while." Sarah's stomach twisted. "How long?" Marks shook his head. "Hard to say without forensics weighing in, but long enough that we're treating this as a serious case." Sarah sat down on the couch, running a hand through her hair. "Do you think something happened back there? Something bad?" The detective didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. He sighed. "We have to consider the possibility. Right now, we're canvassing the neighborhood to see if anyone has reported a missing child." Sarah's breath caught. "A missing child?" The words tasted foreign in her mouth. Marks nodded. "There haven't been any recent reports in this area, but we're widening the search. That's actually why I'm here. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Sarah straightened. "Of course. Have you noticed anything unusual in the past few weeks? Strangers in the neighborhood? Unfamiliar cars parked for long periods? Anything that seemed out of place?" Sarah frowned, thinking back. Her neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people waved at each other, but mostly kept to themselves. Still, she tried to recall anything that might stand out. Then, something tugged at her memory. "There was a van," she said slowly. "Maybe a week ago? It was parked near the end of the street, just past the last house. I remember because it didn't belong to anyone on our block, and it was there for hours." Marks leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember what it looked like?" She nodded. "White, kind of old. No windows on the sides, just the back. It looked like a work van, but there weren't any logos or company names on it." Marks scribbled in his notebook. "Did you see who was inside?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I just thought it was weird at the time. I assumed maybe someone was getting work done on their house, but then the van disappeared, and I didn't think about it again." Marks tapped his pen against the page. "That could be nothing, or it could be something important. I'll have my team check nearby security cameras." Sarah chewed on her lip, her anxiety mounting. "Do you really think a child was out there? Alone?" Marks hesitated. "We don't know yet, but I can tell you that the placement of the items, it doesn't seem random." Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. She wanted to ask what that meant, but she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Marks sighed. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I do need to ask, have you noticed anything strange with Cooper lately? Has he been acting differently?" Sarah glanced down at her golden retriever, who was still sitting attentively at her feet. He looked up at her with those warm brown eyes, tail swishing once across the floor. "No," she said. "Other than finding the shoe, he's been his normal self." Marks nodded. "All right, if anything comes to mind, call me. Even the smallest detail might help." Sarah took the card he handed her, her fingers trembling slightly. She saw herself to the door and watched as the detective stepped off the porch and back toward his car. The neighborhood was starting to wake up now, cars pulling out of driveways, joggers passing by, but all Sarah could see was the edge of the woods, the place where everything had changed. She looked down at Cooper. "What did you find, boy?" she whispered. He wagged his tail, oblivious to the weight pressing on her chest. For the rest of the morning, Sarah tried to go about her normal routine, but everything felt off. Every time she stepped outside, she half expected another officer to show up, or worse, for Cooper to come trotting back with something even more disturbing in his mouth. The police were still in the woods, combing through the area, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they found something definitive. By midday, the quiet unease in her chest had turned into full-blown restlessness. She needed to clear her head. Grabbing Cooper's leash, she decided to take him for a walk. Something normal, something routine. But as she stepped out the front door, her feet hesitated. She glanced down the street, toward where she'd seen that van parked. The image was clearer now in her mind. The way it had sat there, unmoving. The way she had noticed it and then pushed it from her thoughts. Before she could talk herself out of it, she turned in that direction, walking at a brisk pace. Cooper trotted beside her, his tail high, sniffing the air. When she reached the spot where the van had been, she slowed to a stop. The curb was empty now, but something about standing there made her stomach twist. She scanned the area, her eyes catching on the house across the street. Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for as long as Sarah could remember, was sitting on her porch, rocking gently in her chair. Sarah hesitated before crossing the street and stepping up to the short, white fence. "Morning, Mrs. Jenkins," she said with a small smile. The old woman peered at her over the rim of her glasses. "Morning, dear. You look troubled." Sarah exhaled. "Do you remember seeing a van parked over there last week?" She pointed toward the curb. Mrs. Jenkins squinted. "Oh, that white one? Yes, I saw it. Sat there for hours, didn't it?" Sarah nodded. "Did you see who was inside?" The old woman pursed her lips. "Not clearly, but I did see someone get out. A man, tall, with dark hair. He walked into the woods." Sarah's breath caught. "The woods?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded. "Didn't stay long. Came back out maybe 10-15 minutes later, got in the van, and drove off." Sarah's pulse raced. "Did you notice anything else?" The old woman shook her head. "Just that he looked like he was in a hurry." Sarah forced a smile. "Thanks, Mrs. Jenkins." She turned and walked back home, her mind buzzing. A man had gone into the woods, the same woods where Cooper had found the baby's things. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they were forming was making her stomach churn. She needed to tell Detective Marks. And she had a sinking feeling that whatever they were about to uncover was only the beginning. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Her mind was racing, pieces of information trying to fit together in a puzzle that still didn't make sense. A man had gone into the woods. A van had been parked for hours. And then, her dog had found a baby's shoe. There was no way it was a coincidence. She dialed Detective Marks' number, pressing the phone tightly to her ear. It rang twice before he picked up. "Marks." "Detective, it's Sarah Taylor." Her voice came out rushed, but she didn't care. "I just spoke to my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins. She said she saw a man go into the woods the same day that white van was parked at the end of the street." There was a pause. "You're sure?" "She told me he was tall, dark hair, and he wasn't in there long. Maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Then he left in a hurry." Marks exhaled. "That's a lead we can work with. Did she see anything else? A license plate?" Sarah's stomach sank. No, just the van and the man. She didn't get close enough to see any details. It's still something. His voice was firm. I'll send officers to talk to her and check nearby security cameras again. If this man was in the woods, he may have left more than we initially thought. Sarah swallowed. What if... She hesitated. What if he was getting rid of something? Marks didn't respond right away. We're considering every possibility, he finally said. Stay put, and if anything else comes to mind, call me. She ended the call and stared at the phone in her hand. Stay put. As if she could do anything else. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, and she felt a weight pressing against her chest. Cooper nudged her leg, sensing her unease. She reached down, running her fingers through his fur. You started all of this, boy, she whispered. He wagged his tail, happy as ever, oblivious to the storm raging in her mind. The day dragged on in slow motion. She tried to focus on anything else, chores, reading, even watching a movie, but nothing could pull her thoughts away from the woods and the man Mrs. Jenkins had seen. Her nerves were frayed by the time the sun began to set. A knock at the door made her jump. She hurried over, peering through the peephole. It was Detective Marks. She pulled the door open, stepping aside to let him in. We found something, he said without preamble. Sarah's breath hitched. What? Marks held up his phone and showed her a blurry security camera still. It was grainy, but the shape of the white van was unmistakable. The timestamp in the corner was from the day before Cooper found the shoe. This footage is from a house a couple of streets down, Marks explained. The van passed by twice before finally parking. And here, he swiped to the next image. A tall man with dark hair stepping out. The photo was even blurrier, but she could make out a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Sarah's stomach churned. Who is he? Marks frowned. We don't know yet. We ran the van's plates, but they were stolen. We're checking for other footage that might show his face. Sarah exhaled, rubbing her arms. So he just walked into the woods and left? We think so, Marks said. And based on where Mrs. Jenkins saw him go in, we expanded our search area. He hesitated. That's how we found this. He pulled a small plastic evidence bag from his pocket and placed it on the table. Inside was a piece of fabric, faded pink with a floral pattern. Sarah's throat tightened. Is that... A baby blanket, Marks confirmed. It was half buried, like the other items. A chill swept through her body. You think he left it there? Marks was quiet for a moment. We don't know if the man in the van is responsible for all of this, but it's suspicious. Someone left these things in the woods. Someone wanted them hidden. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. You think something happened to a baby? Marks looked her straight in the eye. We're treating this as a potential crime scene. The weight of those words settled over her, suffocating. She thought of the tiny shoe Cooper had found, the onesie, the pacifier, and now this blanket. Marks sighed. Listen, I need you to stay aware. If you see or hear anything unusual, call me immediately. Sarah nodded, though her mind felt like it was spiraling. Marks thanked her and left, and she was alone again, standing in the middle of her living room with fear tightening around her chest. She looked at Cooper. What did you find out there, boy? He thumped his tail, but didn't have an answer. That night, she barely slept. Every sound made her flinch. The distant hum of a car, the rustling of leaves outside her window, the creak of the house settling. It all felt wrong. And then, in the middle of the night, Cooper growled. Sarah shot upright, her heart slamming against her ribs. Cooper was by the window, ears alert, eyes locked on something outside. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to move. She crept toward the window, carefully peeking through the blinds. Her yard was empty. The street was still, but something didn't feel right. She reached for her phone, her fingers cold as she scrolled to Marks's number. Before she could press call, Cooper let out a short, sharp bark. Sarah nearly dropped the phone. She spun toward him. "Cooper? What is it?" His nose was pressed to the glass, his body tense. He wasn't barking wildly, just once, as if trying to warn her. She turned back to the window, staring hard into the darkness. Then, just as she was about to turn away, she saw it, a shadow near the tree line. Still, watching. Her breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the window, her pulse thundering. With shaking hands, she dialed Marks. He picked up immediately. "Sarah?" "There's someone outside," she whispered, pressing her back against the wall. "Near the woods." A pause. Then, "I'm on my way. Don't open the door. Stay inside." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Her hand tightened around Cooper's collar. "Good boy," she murmured. Cooper stayed by her side, his body still tense. Minutes stretched into eternity, but finally flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness. A patrol car pulled up, and an officer stepped out, scanning the yard with a flashlight. Sarah forced herself to move, opening the door just enough to step onto the porch. "There was someone there," she said, pointing toward the trees. "They were just standing there, watching." The officer nodded and spoke into his radio, calling for backup. Sarah stayed on the porch, Cooper at her feet, her heart still hammering. Another officer arrived, and the two of them swept the area, flashlights slicing through the dark. But after 20 minutes, they returned, shaking their heads. "No sign of anyone," one of them said. "But we'll keep a unit nearby just in case." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. "I know what I saw." Marks arrived a few minutes later, his expression tense. "Tell me exactly what happened." She recounted everything. The way Cooper had growled, the figure near the trees, the feeling that she was being watched. Marks's jaw tightened. "Whoever it was, they're not gone for good. And that means we're getting close to something." Sarah swallowed hard, glancing at the woods. Something told her this wasn't over. Not even close. Sarah kept her hands wrapped tightly around the mug of coffee, the heat grounding her as she stared out the window. The morning light was creeping through the trees, casting long shadows across her yard, but it did little to ease the tension in her chest. The night had been long, restless. Even with the police patrolling the area, she hadn't been able to shake the feeling that someone, whoever had been near the woods, was still watching. Cooper lay at her feet, his ears flicking every so often at the sounds outside. He had sensed something last night. He had been the first to notice. She reached down and ran her fingers through his fur, grateful for his presence. He had always been a good dog, but now she was beginning to realize just how much she relied on him. A knock at the door made her jump, sloshing coffee over the rim of her mug. She muttered under her breath, setting it down before hurrying to the door. She checked the peephole first. Detective Marks. Taking a steadying breath, she opened it. "Morning," Marks greeted, his expression serious but not unkind. "Morning," she echoed, stepping aside to let him in. "Did you find anything?" Marks shook his head. "No footprints, no signs of forced entry anywhere. If someone was out there, they knew how to cover their tracks." Sarah swallowed hard. so they could come back. Marks met her gaze. We've increased patrols. You won't be alone out here. It was meant to be reassuring, but it wasn't. She nodded anyway, forcing herself to stay calm. Did you get anything more on the van? Marks exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. We found more footage from another house. The van circled the neighborhood twice before stopping. We also spotted a second person in the passenger seat. Sarah's stomach twisted. So there were two of them? Seems like it. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket. The problem is we still don't know what they were doing. And until we do, I need you to keep an eye out for anything unusual. Sarah glanced toward the woods. You really think they're involved with the things Cooper found? Marks was silent for a moment. It's too much of a coincidence not to be connected. Sarah crossed her arms, rubbing her hands over her sleeves. The air inside her house felt heavier. And what about the baby? Marks sighed. No missing person reports have come in that match what we found. A sinking feeling settled in her chest. So we don't even know if... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Marks shifted his weight. We don't know anything for sure yet. Sarah nodded slowly, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She hated this. The waiting. The unknown. She had never been someone who thrived on mysteries, and this one felt too real, too close to home. Her eyes drifted back to Cooper, who had lifted his head, watching them intently. He had found something that mattered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to find. Marks cleared his throat. I have officers checking the surrounding areas for abandoned properties, sheds, anywhere someone could have left something behind. But if you see or hear anything, I'll call, Sarah finished for him. Marks nodded, satisfied, and glanced toward the door. We'll be in touch. Sarah walked him out, watching as he got into his car and drove off down the street. She stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the morning. The world kept moving, as if nothing had happened, as if there wasn't someone out there who had left pieces of a life in the woods behind her house. She turned back to Cooper. Come on, boy, she murmured. Let's go for a walk. She wasn't sure why she needed to go back into the woods. Maybe it was the restlessness, the way her thoughts refused to settle. Maybe it was something deeper, a pull in her gut that told her there was more to this story. Whatever it was, she grabbed a jacket, clipped on Cooper's leash, and stepped off the porch. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth clinging to the breeze. Cooper led the way, his tail wagging slightly, his nose twitching as he sniffed at the ground. Sarah kept a steady pace, following the path that had been marked off with crime scene tape just a day ago. The tape was still there, fluttering slightly, but the officers were gone. She hesitated at the edge of the search area. Her pulse quickened. What if she found something else? What if she found something she wasn't ready to see? Cooper let out a small huff, glancing back at her as if urging her forward. She exhaled and took a step past the tape. The woods were quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that made her skin prickle, the kind that felt too heavy, too unnatural. She scanned the ground, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Cooper sniffed along a cluster of bushes, his body tensing slightly. Sarah's breath caught. What is it, boy? Cooper pawed at the ground, letting out a short, sharp bark. Sarah's heart pounded as she crouched beside him, brushing away the leaves and dirt. At first, she didn't see anything. Then, just beneath the soil, a glint of something metallic. She carefully reached down, her fingers closing around the object. When she pulled it free, her breath hitched. It was a locket. The chain was tangled, the once gold surface dull with dirt. She wiped at it with her sleeve, revealing an intricate floral engraving. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the small clasp, flipping it open. Inside was a tiny photograph. Faded, but clear enough to see. A baby. Sarah's vision blurred. She snapped the locket shut, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. This was real. This wasn't just forgotten baby clothes or a misplaced shoe. Someone had left this here. Someone who had a reason to hide it. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers barely able to dial Mark's number. When he answered, she forced the words out. "I found something else." There was a pause. Then, "Stay where you are. I'm coming." Sarah's grip tightened on the locket as she looked down at Cooper. "Good boy," she whispered. Cooper wagged his tail, but there was something serious in his eyes, something that told her he knew, just as she did, that this was far from over. Sarah stayed crouched beside Cooper, her fingers still wrapped around the locket. The weight of it in her palm felt heavier than it should have, like it carried something more than just a photo. Her mind raced as she waited for Marks to arrive. The woods had been searched, marked, examined by officers, yet somehow this had been missed. That thought made her stomach twist. What else had been left behind? What else had been buried, just waiting to be uncovered? The sound of tires rolling over gravel made her look up. A police car pulled to a stop near the entrance to the woods, and Detective Marks stepped out, his expression sharp as he scanned the area. He spotted her, nodded once, and made his way toward her. "You okay?" he asked as he crouched beside her, his eyes immediately locking onto the locket in her hand. Sarah swallowed. "I found this buried. Cooper led me to it." Marks pulled on a pair of gloves before carefully taking the locket from her. He examined the engraving, flipping it open with precision. His face hardened as he looked at the photograph inside. "A baby," he murmured. Sarah exhaled shakily. "Does this mean—" Marks didn't answer right away. He studied the locket for a moment before glancing back at her. "This is the most personal item we've found so far. Someone cared about this. Someone carried it with them." Sarah's skin prickled. "Then why would they bury it?" Marks frowned. "That's the question, isn't it?" He pulled out a small evidence bag and carefully placed the locket inside. Standing, he scanned the surrounding area before turning back to her. "Did Cooper react to anything else?" Sarah shook her head. "Just this. He seemed, I don't know, like he knew it was important." Marks nodded slowly, then looked back toward the patrol car. Another officer had arrived, walking toward them with a metal detector. "We're going to do another sweep," Marks said. "We missed this once. I won't let us miss anything else." Sarah stood, brushing dirt off her jeans. "Do you think this belonged to the baby?" Marks exhaled. "It's a possibility." Sarah's fingers curled into her palm. "What if—" She hesitated, unsure if she should even say it. "What if the baby was here?" Marks didn't flinch, but something in his expression darkened. "We don't know that yet." The weight of those words settled in Sarah's chest. She knew what he was really saying. They didn't know if the baby had been here. They didn't know if something had happened. They didn't know if the child was safe. But they also didn't know if they were too late. Sarah watched as the officers spread out, scanning the ground with slow, methodical movements. The sound of the metal detector hummed through the air. Cooper sat beside her, his tail twitching, his eyes following the officers like he understood exactly what was happening. Minutes stretched into an hour. The tension in the air was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. Then suddenly, the metal detector let out a sharp beep. Sarah's breath caught as an officer crouched down, carefully brushing away the dirt. Something metallic glinted beneath the soil. Marks stepped forward, his voice steady. "What is it?" The officer pulled out a small, rusted key. Sarah frowned. "A key?" Marks took it, turning it over in his gloved hand. It was old, worn down by time, but still intact. Sarah's pulse quickened. "That doesn't look like a house key." Marks nodded. "No, it looks like it belongs to something else. A lockbox, maybe. Or," he paused, "a storage unit." Sarah's heart skipped. "You think whoever left the baby's things here had a storage unit?" Marks didn't answer right away. He examined the key again before slipping it into an evidence bag. "We'll run it through our system, see if we can match it to any known storage facilities in the area." Sarah exhaled slowly, trying to process what that meant. If this key led to something else, then it wasn't just about what was in these woods. There was more. And whatever had been hidden in that storage unit could hold the answers they needed. Marks straightened. "You should head home, Sarah. Let us handle this from here." Sarah hesitated. What if Cooper finds something else? Marks gave her a look that was both appreciative and firm. "Then call me. But for now, let us do our job." Sarah nodded reluctantly, calling for Cooper as she turned toward the path leading back to her house. Her mind was spinning with possibilities, with fear, with the weight of the unknown. When she got home, she sat on the couch, staring at her phone. The minutes ticked by slowly. She wanted to call someone. Anyone, but she didn't know what she would say. How did you explain something like this? How did you even begin to understand it? Cooper lay at her feet, his body warm against her legs. He had found something buried, something that had been meant to stay hidden. And Sarah had the sinking feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. Hours later, just as the sun began to dip below the trees, her phone rang. She grabbed it instantly. "Detective?" Mark's voice was calm, but there was something beneath it. Something tense. "We ran the key through our system. It matches a storage facility about 15 miles from here." Sarah's pulse spiked. "And?" Marks hesitated. "The unit is still active. It's rented under a fake name, but the payments have been made consistently." Sarah swallowed. "So whoever owns it is still around." Marks exhaled. "We're heading there now. I'll call you when I have something." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "Be careful." Marks didn't respond right away. Then, "We will." The line went dead. Sarah set the phone down, her hands shaking. She had a feeling that whatever they found in that storage unit would change everything. And she wasn't sure she was ready for the truth. Sarah stared at the phone in her hand long after the call ended. The silence in the room pressed in around her, broken only by the steady breathing of Cooper lying at her feet. Her mind raced with what Marks had told her. A storage unit rented under a fake name. Someone still making payments. What could possibly be inside? She stood abruptly, pacing across the living room. Her gut twisted with unease. She knew she wouldn't be able to sleep until she heard back from Marks. But waiting was the worst part. The uncertainty, the nagging fear that whatever they were about to uncover was something far worse than she had imagined. She checked the clock. If Marks had just left for the storage facility, it would be at least another hour before he got back to her. Maybe longer. The thought of sitting here doing nothing made her restless. Cooper lifted his head as she grabbed her jacket and keys. "Come on, boy. Let's take a drive." The golden retriever hopped up immediately, his tail wagging. He didn't know where they were going, but he was always ready for an adventure. Sarah clipped on his leash, locking the door behind her before heading to the car. As she drove through town, she forced herself to breathe deeply to keep her mind from spiraling. She hadn't even realized where she was headed until she pulled onto the familiar street. The storage facility was only 15 miles away, but she wasn't going there. Instead, she had driven toward the edge of town, to the last place she had seen that white van. She pulled over near the wooded area where Mrs. Jenkins had seen the man enter. The police had already searched the woods behind her house, but had they checked this spot? Had they followed the route that man had taken? She unbuckled her seatbelt, glancing at Cooper. "Let's take a look." Stepping out of the car, she scanned the area. It was quiet, eerily so. The houses nearby had their lights off, and the street felt deserted. Pulling her jacket tighter around her, she guided Cooper toward the trees. The ground was soft under her feet, the smell of damp earth thick in the air. Cooper sniffed along the path, his ears twitching as he moved ahead of her. She had no idea what she was looking for, but she felt compelled to be here. Something about this place pulled at her. Cooper suddenly stopped, his body tensing. Sarah's breath caught. "What is it, boy?" He let out a low whine, sniffing furiously at a patch of dirt near the base of a tree. Sarah hesitated before kneeling beside him, brushing away the leaves and loose soil. Her heart pounded as something small and white appeared beneath the dirt. Another piece of fabric. Her stomach flipped as she pulled it free. It was a tiny sock, stained with dirt, but unmistakably similar to the onesie and shoe Cooper had found before. A baby's sock. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone and dialed Mark's. "Tell me you didn't go out looking for more." Mark's voice came through the line, sharp and weary. I'm near where Mrs. Jenkins saw the man with the van," she admitted. "Cooper found something, another piece of clothing." There was silence on the other end before Marks finally spoke. "Stay where you are. I'm sending someone now." Sarah exhaled shakily, shoving the sock into her pocket. "Just hurry." She hung up, looking around nervously. The night suddenly felt darker, the trees taller, the shadows deeper. What if whoever had been here before came back? What if she wasn't as alone as she thought? Cooper pressed against her leg, his body warm and reassuring. "We're okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "We're okay." It wasn't long before flashing lights cut through the night. A patrol car pulled up, and 2 officers stepped out. Sarah stood quickly, holding out the sock. "It was buried," she said, her voice unsteady. "Just like the other things." One of the officers took it, nodding. "We'll get it bagged, and we'll expand the search to this area." Sarah swallowed, looking back toward the trees. "You don't think... could the baby have been here?" The officers exchanged a look before the older one spoke. "We won't know until we finish searching, but this confirms that something happened. Someone left these things behind for a reason." Sarah shivered. "Detective Marks said he was going to check the storage unit. Have you heard anything?" The officer shook his head. "Not yet. But if he finds something, we'll know soon." Sarah exhaled slowly. She didn't know if she wanted to know what was inside that unit. But she had a feeling that whatever it was, it would be the missing piece to everything. She stayed while the officers combed the area, their flashlights sweeping through the trees. More cars arrived, more officers. The search was expanding, but it only made Sarah's chest tighten. How much had been hidden out here? How much had been left behind, waiting to be found? Her phone buzzed. Mark's. She answered immediately. "Detective?" Mark's voice was low, controlled. "We got into the storage unit." Sarah's stomach clenched. "And?" "It was packed," Mark said. "Boxes stacked to the ceiling. Old furniture, random junk. But near the back, we found something wrapped in plastic." Sarah's breath hitched. "What was it?" Marks was silent for a beat before answering. "A baby carrier, and inside it, another onesie, similar to the one you found in the woods." Sarah felt dizzy. "A baby carrier? You mean—" "It was empty," Marks cut in quickly. "But it was placed there carefully, almost like someone meant to keep it safe. We're still going through everything. There are documents, letters. We need time to piece it all together." Sarah gripped her phone tighter. Does this mean the baby was real? That it wasn't just forgotten things in the woods?" Marks exhaled. "We don't know yet. But this storage unit, the buried items, the fake name on the lease, it all points to someone trying to hide something. We just don't know if they were hiding a child, or the memory of one." Sarah's throat felt tight. She looked down at Cooper, who was still standing alert beside her, his eyes locked onto the officers searching the woods. "Detective, do you think the baby is still out there?" Marks hesitated. "That's what we need to find out." Sarah hung up, her fingers trembling. She looked around at the darkened woods, the flashlights moving between the trees, the officers speaking in hushed tones. Something had happened here. Something that someone had tried to bury, and she had a feeling that whoever had left these things behind wasn't finished yet. Sarah sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, her mind racing with possibilities. Cooper rested in the passenger seat, his ears flicking every so often as if he too could sense the tension in the air. The weight of what Marks had just told her pressed down on her chest. A baby carrier, carefully placed. A storage unit rented under a fake name. Buried baby items spread throughout the woods. None of it made sense, but at the same time, it all pointed to one thing. Someone had been trying to keep something hidden. Her fingers tightened around the wheel. She needed answers. Waiting for Marks to piece it all together wasn't enough. She had to understand what was happening, why this was happening. And there was only one person left to talk to. Mrs. Jenkins. She pulled out of the wooded lot and turned onto the quiet suburban street where the elderly woman lived. The neighborhood was still, most houses dark as families settled in for the night. But as Sarah approached, she saw the faint glow of a lamp from inside Mrs. Jenkins' home. She was still awake. Parking along the curb, Sarah hesitated for a moment before stepping out. Cooper followed her, his leash loose in her grip as they walked up the pathway to the front porch. Before she could knock, the door creaked open slightly, and Mrs. Jenkins peered out through the crack. "Sarah? What are you doing here so late?" Sarah forced a tight smile. "I was hoping I could ask you a few more questions about that van you saw." Mrs. Jenkins' eyes narrowed slightly, but she stepped back, allowing Sarah to enter. The house smelled like cinnamon and old books, and the warmth inside was a stark contrast to the chill in Sarah's bones. Cooper sat beside her obediently, as Mrs. Jenkins eased herself into her rocking chair, motioning for Sarah to take a seat on the couch. "I told the police everything I know, dear," the old woman said, her hands resting in her lap. "It was a van. A man went into the woods. He left quickly." Sarah nodded, exhaling slowly. "I know, but is there anything else? Anything at all that stood out to you?" even if it seemed small or unimportant at the time. Mrs. Jenkins was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. The ticking clock on the wall filled the space between them until finally she sighed. "It's just a feeling," she murmured. "I've lived here a long time, Sarah. I know when something isn't right. That man, he wasn't just passing through, he was looking for something." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Looking for something?" Mrs. Jenkins nodded. "He didn't just walk into those woods blindly. He had a purpose. He knew where he was going." She leaned forward slightly. "And when he came out, he was empty-handed. But I swear, there was something different about him. The way he moved, the way he kept looking over his shoulder, as if he'd left something behind." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "You think he buried something?" Mrs. Jenkins met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Don't you?" Sarah's breath came out shakily. She stood abruptly, needing to move, to think. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins." The old woman watched her carefully. "Be careful, Sarah. Some things are buried for a reason." Sarah swallowed hard, nodding before stepping outside with Cooper. The cold air hit her like a wave, but she barely felt it. Her mind was racing. If the man in the van had been looking for something, had he found it? Or had he left it behind, deeper in the woods? She knew she had to call Marks, but instead her fingers hovered over her phone, debating. Her gut told her there was something more, something no one had found yet. And if she was right, then waiting wasn't an option. She looked down at Cooper. "We're going back." The golden retriever wagged his tail, as if ready for the next adventure. She drove back toward the wooded area, pulling off onto the shoulder. The flashing lights from the police vehicles were gone now, the search team likely having paused for the night. But Sarah wasn't going to wait. She stepped out, grabbing a flashlight from her glove compartment before clicking Cooper's leash into place. The beam of light cut through the darkness as they moved into the trees, her heart hammering in her chest. Every sound felt amplified, the crunch of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of branches swaying in the wind. Cooper moved ahead of her, nose to the ground, his body tense. She let him lead, trusting his instincts more than her own. They moved deeper than before, past the area where the sock had been buried, past the tree where the first shoe had been found. The deeper they went, the colder the air seemed to grow. Then Cooper stopped. Sarah's breath hitched. "What is it, boy?" The dog sniffed furiously at the ground, circling a small patch of disturbed dirt. Sarah crouched, shining her flashlight over the area. The soil was looser here, recently moved. Her stomach twisted as she reached forward, digging her fingers into the dirt. Something solid met her touch. A wooden box, small, locked with a rusted latch. Her heart pounded as she pulled it free, brushing away the dirt. The wood was old, the edges worn. She reached for the latch, hesitating before finally pushing it open. Inside, folded carefully, was a stack of papers. And sitting on top of them, a hospital bracelet. Sarah's pulse skyrocketed. She lifted it gently, her hands trembling as she read the faded name printed on the tag. An infant's name, a birth date. And below it, mother's name. Emily Dawson. Sarah's mind reeled. This was it. Proof that there had been a baby. Proof that someone had wanted to hide the truth. Cooper let out a low whimper beside her, as if sensing the weight of what they had found. Sarah's fingers dialed Mark's number before she could even think. When he picked up, she didn't give him a chance to speak. "Detective, I found something. A box. Documents. A hospital bracelet. The mother's name is Emily Dawson." There was silence on the other end before Marks's voice came through, sharp and focused. "Stay where you are. We're coming." Sarah hung up, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked at the name again, burning it into her memory. Emily Dawson. Who was she? And where was her baby? Sarah crouched beside the wooden box, her breath coming in quick, uneven bursts. The name on the hospital bracelet was seared into her mind. Emily Dawson. Who was she? Where was she? And more importantly, where was her baby? Cooper shifted beside her, his body tense, ears flicking toward every sound in the woods. Sarah could feel the weight of the discovery settling in her chest like a heavy stone. She knew Marks and the police were on their way, but every second that passed felt like an eternity. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the stack of papers beneath the bracelet. The top one was brittle, yellowed with age. A birth certificate. She angled her flashlight over it, scanning the faded ink. It confirmed what she feared. Baby's name, Olivia Dawson. Mother's name, Emily Dawson. Father's name, unknown date of birth, September 3rd, 2016. Sarah swallowed hard. This wasn't just an abandoned storage unit mystery. This was a child. A real, living baby. At least at some point. She flipped through the other papers, her pulse hammering in her ears. Medical records. Notes scribbled in the margins. A discharge form from a hospital. But what made her stomach twist was the final document. A letter, written in rushed, almost frantic handwriting. "If something happens to me, please make sure Olivia is safe. I don't trust them. They said they'd take care of us, but I know the truth. I know what they did. If you find this, please don't let them find her." Sarah's throat closed. Them. Who was Emily talking about? Who had she been running from? The snap of twigs behind her made her whip around, heart slamming against her ribs. Flashlights bobbed between the trees, and then Marks emerged, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," he said, voice low. "Step back." She did, hands raised, as Marks approached, followed by 2 officers. One of them knelt beside the box, slipping on gloves before carefully lifting the documents out. The officer's eyes flickered with something, concern, maybe even unease, as he passed them to Marks. Marks studied them, his jaw tightening. "Emily Dawson," he muttered. "We don't have any recent records on her, but this baby, Olivia Dawson, she'd be about 8 years old now." Sarah's stomach turned. "If she's alive." Marks didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt, picking up the letter. His eyes darkened as he read it, his grip tightening on the paper. "This isn't just someone abandoning a baby's things. This is a warning." Sarah's skin prickled. "Then we need to find Olivia." Marks nodded, slipping the letter into an evidence bag. "First, we find out what happened to Emily. If she was running from someone, we need to know who." One of the officers spoke up. "We should check missing persons databases, old case files, see if she reported anything before disappearing." Marks looked at Sarah. "You found this here, buried. Whoever put it here didn't want it discovered. That means whoever they were hiding from might still be out there." Sarah's blood ran cold. "And they might know I found it." Marks's eyes darkened. "That's why you're not going anywhere alone. From this moment on, we do this by the book." Sarah exhaled shakily, but nodded. She knew she had already waded too deep into this. There was no turning back now. The officers began processing the scene, carefully placing the documents into evidence bags. Sarah watched as they worked, but her mind was elsewhere. Olivia Dawson was out there somewhere. And if her mother had gone through so much trouble to hide her, that meant someone else had been looking for her. The question was, had they found her first? The next morning, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at her untouched coffee. The events of the night before played on a loop in her head. The name, the letter, the fear woven into every piece of it. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. Marks. She answered immediately. "Did you find something?" His voice was tense. "We ran Emily Dawson's name through missing persons databases. There was never an official report filed for her. No record of her being reported missing." Sarah frowned. "How is that possible? She left behind all that paperwork, that letter. Someone had to know she was in trouble." Marks sighed. "That's the thing. She wasn't reported missing. But there is a record of her in child services files. She was in and out of foster care until she turned 18. Then she disappeared off the grid. No credit history, no job records, nothing. It's like she vanished." Sarah's grip tightened on her phone. "And Olivia?" Marks hesitated. "There's no birth record in the state registry. The certificate you found, it's not in any official database. It looks real, but it was never filed." Sarah's chest tightened. "So, what does that mean?" "It means Olivia Dawson doesn't officially exist." The word sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "Someone erased her." "Or someone never wanted her to be found," Marks said. "We're running checks on old hospital records, trying to track down where Emily might have gone after she gave birth. But it's going to take time." Sarah exhaled slowly. "What do we do in the meantime?" Marks hesitated. "You stay alert. If someone went through this much trouble to hide Olivia, they may not want people asking questions." Sarah's stomach knotted. "You think they know I found the box?" Marks didn't respond immediately. "Let's just say I don't like coincidences. Be careful, Sarah." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I will." After hanging up, Sarah set her phone down and rubbed her temples. Cooper nudged her leg, sensing her unease. She gave him a small smile, running a hand over his fur. "You're the only one who knows how to find the truth, huh?" The dog wagged his tail, but his eyes stayed fixed on her, as if he understood the weight of what they had uncovered. She knew she wouldn't be able to sit still. If Emily had gone through so much trouble to hide Olivia, that meant something had happened. Something that forced her to disappear. And Sarah needed to know what it was. She grabbed her jacket and car keys. "Come on, boy. We're going to find some answers." She didn't know where this would lead, but she had a feeling the truth was closer than she thought, and someone was willing to do anything to keep it buried. Sarah gripped the steering wheel as she pulled out of her driveway, the morning air still thick with uncertainty. Cooper sat in the passenger seat, his ears perked, watching the road ahead as if he understood the weight of their mission. She didn't have a concrete plan, just a name and a growing sense that she was running out of time. Emily Dawson. A woman who had gone to great lengths to disappear. A mother who had been desperate to keep her child hidden. And Olivia. An erased identity. It didn't make sense. Someone had buried those documents, hidden them in the woods, locked them away in a storage unit. Someone had wanted to erase them from history. But why? Sarah's fingers tightened around the wheel. If Marks was going through official records, she needed to take a different approach. She needed to start where Emily Dawson had left her last trace. The hospital. She pulled into the parking lot of the county hospital, the place that had been listed on the birth certificate. It was an older building, modernized in patches, but it still held the weight of time. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car, glancing at Cooper. You stay here, boy. I'll be right back. The golden retriever let out a soft huff, but settled in the passenger seat, watching her as she made her way inside. The lobby smelled like antiseptic and coffee, and the hum of conversation and beeping machines filled the space. Sarah approached the front desk, her pulse steady, but her nerves frayed. "Hi," she said, offering a polite smile to the receptionist. "I was wondering if I could get some information on a past patient." The woman, a middle-aged nurse with tired eyes, gave her a skeptical look. "Are you family?" Sarah hesitated. "No, but I think she might be in danger. Her name is Emily Dawson. She gave birth here in 2016. I just need to know if there's any record of where she went after she was discharged." The receptionist frowned. "I'm sorry, but we can't release patient information without proper authorization." Sarah had expected that. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Listen, I know this is against policy, but I found records that someone tried to bury. Emily Dawson left behind a letter saying she was afraid for her life. If you can't tell me anything directly, can you at least confirm if there was something unusual about her case? Did she leave here with her baby? Did someone else pick her up?" The woman's eyes flickered with something. Recognition? Hesitation? She exhaled, glancing around before lowering her voice. "Look, I can't tell you much, but I remember that name. It was a strange case." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Strange how?" The receptionist leaned in slightly. "Most mothers leave with their babies within a couple of days, right? But Emily, she was discharged alone." Sarah's stomach flipped. "Alone? What about Olivia?" The woman shook her head. "I don't know what happened to the baby, but when she left, she didn't have her child with her." Sarah felt a cold wave wash over her. Was there any indication that something happened? Did she say anything before she left? The receptionist hesitated again, then sighed. "I remember she was terrified. Kept looking over her shoulder, kept asking if someone had been by to see her. She didn't even wait for the usual discharge process, just left as soon as she was cleared medically." Sarah swallowed hard. "Did she say who she was afraid of?" The woman shook her head. "She didn't, but I remember a man came looking for her a couple of days later. He wasn't staff. Said he was a relative, but I don't think he was. He was too off. He kept pressing for information, asking where she had gone." Sarah's heart pounded. "Did he give a name?" The receptionist hesitated. "I don't remember, but there might still be a visitor log from that time, if security didn't purge it." Sarah straightened. "How can I see it?" The woman sighed. "Officially? You can't. But if you happen to know someone in security who might be willing to pull old records." She gave Sarah a pointed look before going back to her paperwork. Sarah took the hint. "Thank you." She turned and made her way toward the security desk near the entrance. A heavy-set man with graying hair and a sharp gaze sat behind the desk, flipping through a logbook. Sarah approached with a polite smile. "Hi. I was hoping you could help me with something." The man looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Depends on what it is." Sarah took a steadying breath. "I'm looking for information on a visitor from 2016. A man who came here asking about Emily Dawson. It's really important." The guard studied her for a moment before sighing. "You a cop?" "No, but I'm working with one. And this could be a matter of life or death." The man scratched his chin before pushing back from his desk. "Give me a minute." Sarah held her breath as he disappeared into the back room. Time seemed to stretch as she waited, her heart pounding. Finally, he returned, holding an old visitor log. "Lucky for you, we still have records from that time," he muttered, flipping through the pages. Emily Dawson. Yeah, here we go. There was a visitor who asked about her 2 days after she was discharged. No listed relation, just a name. Sarah leaned forward. What name? The guard turned the book toward her, tapping a line with his finger. James Adler. Sarah's breath caught. Who is he? The guard shook his head. No clue. We don't keep ID copies, just the names visitors give us. Could be fake, could be real, but he was looking for her, and he wasn't happy when he left without answers. Sarah swallowed hard. Did he come back? The guard flipped a few more pages. Not that I can see. Looks like he asked once and never returned. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she stepped back. Thank you. This helps more than you know. She left the hospital in a daze, her mind racing. James Adler. A name. A lead. Whoever he was, he had been looking for Emily. And he hadn't found her. She slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel as she processed everything. If this man had been after Emily, then maybe he had been after Olivia too. Her phone rang, making her jump. She fumbled to answer it. Marks? Sarah, we got something, Marks said, his voice tense. We cross-checked Emily Dawson's name with old case files. We found a police report from 2017. Sarah's breath hitched. What happened? Marks hesitated. It was filed anonymously. A woman reported being followed, said she feared for her safety. The case never went anywhere. No official complaint, no suspect listed. But the details match. She said someone named James Adler was after her. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. So he didn't just look for her at the hospital. He hunted her. Marks exhaled sharply. And if he was looking for Emily, he was looking for Olivia too. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Do you think he found them? Marks was quiet for a long moment before finally saying, That's what we need to find out. Sarah closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. James Adler. A name connected to Emily's fear. A name linked to the missing baby. And now, after all this time, a name that might be coming after her. She looked down at Cooper, who was watching her with calm, knowing eyes. Looks like we just found the next piece, boy, but I don't think we're the only ones looking. Cooper let out a soft whine, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just uncovering a mystery. They were walking straight into it. Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her pulse quickening as the weight of everything crashed down around her. James Adler. A name that had been lurking in the shadows of Emily Dawson's life. A name that had surfaced just as Sarah had started putting the pieces together. She had spent days chasing after answers, following the trail left behind, but now she realized something chilling. Someone else was following it too. Cooper let out a soft whine from the passenger seat, his golden fur illuminated by the streetlights as she sat parked outside her house. The fear gnawed at her. If James Adler had been looking for Emily and Olivia back then, what if he still was? And what if he knew Sarah was getting too close? Her phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. Marks. Sarah, where are you? I just got home, she said. Did you find anything else? Marks hesitated. We ran Adler's name through our system. He has no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, but there are traces of him in old reports, unfiled complaints, witness accounts of a man asking too many questions about young women. It's like he always slipped through the cracks. He's a ghost. Sarah's stomach twisted. So he's been doing this for years. Looks like it, Marks said. And here's the part that concerns me. We checked the most recent database activity connected to his name. There was a search request filed under a private investigator's license. Someone's been trying to find Emily Dawson again. Sarah's breath caught. Recently? 2 weeks ago. The air in the car suddenly felt suffocating. Someone was actively looking for Emily, possibly Olivia. And now, Sarah had put herself right in the middle of it. She glanced at her house. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow, but for the first time, it didn't feel safe. Marks, what if they know I've been asking questions? That's why I'm telling you this, he said. We don't know if Adler's the one still looking, or if it's someone else connected to him. But Sarah, you need to be careful. We're working on tracking the search request back to its source, but until then, I don't want you going anywhere alone. Sarah exhaled shakily. Understood. She hung up and sat still for a long moment, trying to process it all. Every instinct in her body told her that she had stepped into something much bigger than she had realized. But she wasn't going to back down now. Emily Dawson had tried to protect her daughter. Someone had tried to erase them. But Sarah was going to make sure their story didn't disappear. She reached over and ran her fingers through Cooper's fur, drawing comfort from his steady presence. We're going to finish this, she whispered, no matter what it takes. As she stepped out of the car, the night felt eerily quiet. Too quiet. She glanced around before making her way up to her front door, unlocking it quickly and stepping inside. She flipped on the lights, locking the door behind her. Cooper followed close, his ears twitching as if he, too, could sense something was off. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A single envelope, sitting on her kitchen table. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't left anything there. She had locked the house before she left. Someone had been inside. With shaking hands, she picked up the envelope. There was no name, no address, just a single piece of folded paper inside. She opened it, her eyes scanning the message scribbled in jagged handwriting. Some things should stay buried. Walk away. Sarah's fingers trembled. Her blood turned ice cold. Someone had broken into her home just to leave her this warning. Whoever they weren't just trying to scare her. They were telling her she was next.